Welcome to CUNY Laureates, the show about CUNY graduates who went on to win major awards in their respective fields. On this episode, we profile another 3 Pulitzer Prize winners who graduated from the City University of New York. First, Oscar Handlin's book, The Uprooted, helped change how America saw its own history and eventually America itself. Gregory Podlow, an alum of the CUNY Graduate Center, writes poetry that fuses his own life with observations on family history, America, culture, and myth. Finally, from Brooklyn to Ireland and back again, Frank McCourt escaped unbearable poverty to not only enlighten young minds through teaching, but also captivate the world with his stirring memoir. Once I thought to write a history of the immigrants in America. Then I discovered that the immigrants were American history. With those 2 frequently quoted sentences, so began a story that would go on to change how America saw itself, with profound consequences. This is the story of a CUNY graduate who became a Pulitzer Prize winner and the book he wrote that remade America. Life as a peasant in 18th century Europe wasn't easy. Despite generations of literature, movies, and video games that paint a rosy picture of idyllic agrarian lifestyles untarnished by modernity, peasant life was anything but ideal. Existing in a delicate balance between the pressures of their community, the land, and the authorities ruling over them, peasants survived only through strict social roles and obligations, where each individual knew what was expected of them from birth to death. But with the population growth and political changes of the 1800s, millions of peasants lost the ability to support themselves. Their choice was plain: move or perish. With grief in their hearts, they left the only lives they ever knew and set off on foot towards the Atlantic Ocean. Oscar Handlin was only 8 years old when he decided that he would be a historian. His parents, Russian Jewish immigrants who had fled persecution under the Tsar, strongly valued intellectual cultivation, and Oscar was constantly reading history books, even as he walked to make deliveries for his father's grocery store. This early intellectual blooming also made Oscar something of a rebellious student, and he progressed through his early public school education in fits and starts. But it was at Brooklyn College where Oscar found his focus. Surrounded by the student activism of the 1930s, Oscar remained independent and skeptical of simplistic solutions, instead preferring to immerse himself in the complexities of history. His listlessness now behind him, he graduated in 1934, ready to blaze ahead. Oscar moved on to Harvard University, where he earned his master's in 1935 and subsequently won a Frederick Sheldon Fellowship to conduct research in Europe. Setting out from Boston on his trip, Oscar crossed that same ocean as those peasant immigrants 100 years earlier.
As they lined up for the roll call, their curious gaze sought out the features of this, their unfamiliar home. The rising masts, the great folds of sail, the web of rigging, and the bold, pointed bowsprit. There was time before they passed through the estuary to the empty ocean to reflect on the long way they had come, to mingle with the hope and gratitude of escape, the sadness and resentment of flight.
In his Pulitzer Prize-winning book, The Uprooted, Oscar tells the story of the 35 million Europeans who migrated to the United States over the course of 150 years. He describes the journey from Europe to America as a harrowing one, both in the sea voyage itself and in the ports and trips across unfamiliar lands. It was the first time that peasants were forced to make decisions alone, without the community to guide them. But it wouldn't be the last. Settling mostly in cities during the rapid industrialization of America, the peasants' immigrant experience, according to Oscar, was primarily one of alienation. Alienation from the communities they had left in Europe and from the dominant culture they now found themselves in. Alienation even from the earth itself, as their agrarian lifestyles were transformed into ones of urban and factory labor.
Now he was to act within a realm of inanimate things. Senseless iron shapes will everlastingly be about him, and stone will hem him in, on city street, in mill or mine. He through whose hands all of production had then passed, from the dropped seed to the eaten bread, often now could not tell what manner of thing his labor made. Its shape, its quality, its function, such labor was labor for its own sake, and meaningless.
Oscar received his PhD in 1940 and joined the Harvard faculty, becoming one of the first full-time Jewish professors at the school. His dissertation had been about the immigrants of Boston in the 18th and 19th centuries, and he decided to explore the subject more fully in The Uprooted. Aimed at the general public rather than academia, The Uprooted is a poetically written, soulful account of the 19th century immigrant experience in America, mostly foregoing direct quotes or attributions in favor of imagining the inner lives, hopes, and fears of the people who found themselves on the shores of a bewildering new land. Published in 1951, the book had a powerful effect on the public's perception of immigration, which had all but ended by the 1950s after extremely strict and racist laws in 1921 and 1924 slowed migration to a trickle. It was this impression on the public that Oscar was able to leverage when he testified in front of Congress in support of the Immigration and Nationality Act. Passed in 1965, the Immigration and Nationality Act abolished the earlier quota system, which had discriminated against Asians and other groups, and completely remade the demographics of immigrants entering the United States. Oscar Handlen has been recognized as a crucial behind-the-scenes influence in its passage. Oscar went on to have an immensely prolific writing career, with some labeling him the father of immigration studies. But like many fathers, Oscar did not always see eye to eye with successive generations. He came to develop a reputation for conservatism in academia when he resisted attempts by younger scholars to reanalyze history through the studies of race and gender. Having planted the study of history into fertile new ground, Oscar now found it being uprooted yet again. But if his writing is any indication, perhaps that precarity itself was essential. By the end of The Uprooted, Oscar contends that the alienation experienced by immigrants in the 19th century proved to be a defining characteristic of America. Lonely, poor, and desperate to hold on to what few traditions they could, immigrants pooled their meager resources to form community groups, to publish their own newspapers, to produce literature and theater. Divorced from the old villages of Europe, where strict obligations had directed so much of a person's life and decision-making, these new communities became laboratories of American politics and culture, breeding the kind of innovation that drove the nation's global ascent. And in that way, they became inseparable from the American story.
In our flight, unattached, we discovered what it was to be an individual, a man apart from place and station. In our flight through the newness, we discovered the unexpected, invigorating effects of recurrent demands upon the imagination, upon all our human capacities. We will not have our nest become again a moldy prison holding us in with its tangled web of comfortable habits.
In his 1973 edition of The Uprooted, Oscar wrote, "The book tells an epic story. At the time of writing, there was a possibility that it, like other epics, would have a tragic conclusion. 20 years later, there is still a possibility that it might not. Today, 50 more years have passed, and that story continues, as dramatic as ever. But the question remains for us as it did for those European peasants 200 years ago. Will we keep moving, or will we perish?" Poetry can embrace anything, from culture, myths, or place, to one's own life and history, but it takes a committed poet to embrace them all. This is the story of a CUNY graduate who became a Pulitzer Prize winner, and whose poetry stretches from ancient Greece to heartfelt and complex remembrances of his father.
I was born in minutes in a roadside kitchen, a skillet whispering my name. I was born to rainwater and lie. I was born across the river where I was borrowed with clothespins, a harrow tooth, broadsides sewn in my shoes. I returned no fault of my own. I think of it as I am calling upon as much of myself and my awareness as possible. To do anything different would be to attempt to fit myself into accepted narratives, identity narratives. There's another long tradition in African American literature of subverting stereotypes. And I think there's some of that impulse in my work. But there's also just this refusal to be the representative of anything, really. And so when I'm bringing in references and changing diction, my argument is this is what we do all the time, and that what is unnatural is the way people behave in order to make themselves legible in a particular in a particular sense of identity. I read minds before I could read fishes and loaves. I walked a piece of the way alone before I was born.
Gregory Podlow was raised in a suburban town outside of Philadelphia called Willingboro.
Willingboro was a Levitt town, which means that there were a handful of models of homes. My neighborhood and the town was very familiar and very domestic. I often think of Willingboro as a kind of Harlem of South Jersey, right? It was a very multicultural and diverse town when I was growing up.
Podlow played tennis and was on the swim and diving teams, as well as the Cub Scouts.
All of that stuff kind of forms my sense of belonging, which I think is really important. I'm not writing as an outsider. I'm writing as someone who very much owns this culture and is invested in the success of this experiment, this democratic experiment.
But the age of 13 was marked by a seismic event. His father, Greg Sr., participated in the air traffic controllers strike of 1981 as a union member. The strike was brutally ended when President Ronald Reagan fired over 11,000 controllers who had refused to go back to work. The incident was life-altering for the young Greg. He later wrote his memoir, Air Traffic, a memoir of ambition and manhood in America about this time.
It was such a stark change in our family life and our conditions. Such a stark change in my father's life and his self-image, right? And so me being at puberty at the time, I think that had a big impact on my self-image as a man. What were the acceptable narratives that one could grow into? My father losing his job and being kind of adrift for a while gave me permission to be an artist.
The family struggled, but Greg still planned on going to college.
I remember when I was very young, they proudly showed me the treasury bills that they were saving for my college tuition. That just reinforced the narrative, the inevitability that I was going to college, right? In my mind, it was a done deal. But of course, after the firing, after the strike, all of that went up in smoke.
Instead, Greg joined the Marines.
I decided if I was going to reinvent myself or invent myself, period, that this was a good opportunity. Of course, I wasn't thinking that consciously at the time, right? But I think deep down there was a sense of this is an opportunity for a clean slate. Whatever I come out as on the other end will be largely self-made. My pop let me steer when I was small enough to snug between his belly and the wheel. Any random intersection, he might hoist me across the handbrake onto his lap to pilot the wagon before returning me to earth. One of the things I'm interested in is the constructions of identity in general, particularly constructions of masculinity. When we say the patriarchy, what are we actually talking about? For me, my father is always going to be present in that conversation. He's present as a life that I didn't lead, right? He's a case study that I know intimately, and therefore I call on that awareness quite a bit. Swinging our private chariot of steel and bone.
Sometime after the Marines, Greg worked at a jazz club owned by his grandfather called Serengeti's Cafe and Jazz Club in Pennsauken.
And they were just consummate musicians, and they were passionate about their craft, and they were talking about the art. And it was just such a revelation for me to be around people who cared about their work in that way.
Watching jazz musicians gave him the notion that a creative life was possible. At the same time, an academic life began to take shape. He studied at Rutgers in Camden and enrolled in the MFA program at NYU for poetry. After this, he began to teach at CUNY, at Hunter College, John Jay, and Medgar Evers College.
It was liberating to realize, to understand that I could have that kind of a relationship to the academy, because I had always thought of schoolwork as arduous and you know, something drudgery. And now suddenly I'm skipping to school and I can't wait to get into class.
Pardlo also studied at Columbia University and was enrolled there when he won the Pulitzer Prize for his first book, Digest. He eventually earned his PhD from the CUNY Graduate Center.
Digest is me thinking through what it means to be a father, what it means to be a husband, thinking about my this kind of holistic approach where everything is material for my work.
Eventually, Pardlo found his way to NYU's Abu Dhabi campus, where he has been a full professor for 3 years. And in 2024, his latest book of poetry, Spectral Evidence, was published.
It comes at a more specific social cultural issue. There is this existential problem of what it means for me to exist in this society. And that is that I am constantly at risk of being killed by a police officer. I know I say that, and the world hears something overblown and exaggerated and unwarranted, but the truth is, it is a reality in my mind. I know that at any moment, an interaction can go wildly wrong, right? And I've seen it happen. I've experienced it enough times that I know it's a reality. So, given that I love this country and this culture and my friends and neighbors and family as much as I do, this is something I have to reconcile with. How do I navigate a world that discounts the reality that I live with? I'm using my life as a sort of canvas for the kinds of social and cultural criticism that I want to make. What's on the page is also, here is this guy, Greg Pardlo, who occupies a particular social location, and let's see what impact the world has on his life, right? And so that's kind of the approach that I have. Let this power invested of gavel and oath help her give birth through her mouth like a god.
America has no shortage of immigrant stories. Stories of financial woe and discrimination are sadly part of many families' histories. But it takes a true skill, a love of storytelling, some determination, and a little bit of luck to tell a tragic tale beautifully. This is the story of a CUNY graduate who became a Pulitzer Prize winner and his astonishing and unlikely rise out of the ashes.
When I look back on my childhood, I wonder how I survived it all. It was, of course, a miserable childhood. The happy childhood is hardly worth your while. Worse than the ordinary miserable childhood is the miserable Irish childhood, and worse yet is the miserable Irish Catholic childhood.
But Ireland is not where this story begins. Frank McCourt was born in Brooklyn, New York on August 19, 1930, 9 months after his Irish immigrant parents met at a local party. Father Malachi and Mother Angela were married in time to avoid scandal. Malachi was prone to drink and fantasy. Angela was a pious woman, but was often conflicted by the realities of immigrant life in America. After Frank, a younger brother, twin boys, and a baby sister followed in swift order. Hampered by his love of drink and the continued stigmatization of Irish immigrants over stereotypes he sadly lived up to, Malachi Sr. was rarely employed. The Great Depression raged on, and the family of 7 sadly became a family of 6 when Frank's youngest sister passed away less than a month after her birth. This tragic event scarred the entire family, especially Frank's mother, Angela. The McCourts were desperate for a better life and decided to do the unthinkable. They moved back to Ireland.
We must have been the only Irish family in history to be saying goodbye to the Statue of Liberty instead of hello.
For better or worse, and mostly worse, life back in Ireland started the churning of story in Frank's head that he would hold on to and build upon for the rest of his life. Settled in Angela's hometown of Limerick, their situation saw no improvement. McCourt Sr., when employed, drank away his wages and was again stigmatized over his Northern Irish accent, which was taboo in this southern town. Whether in Brooklyn or Ireland, the McCourts were always outsiders. The poverty was crippling, and the twins didn't survive, and the McCourts were barely holding on.
My father, by day, when he wasn't drinking, was the perfect father. When he get money, then he was a maniac. It was 2 different men.
Though a failure as a parent, Malachi Sr. instilled in his children a love of story and poetry. When home and sober, the boys enjoyed his songs of Irish heroes during morning tea, and was entertainment that took them, though briefly, out of their situation. In a pivotal though near-tragic moment, 10-year-old Frank contracted typhoid fever and was sent to a hospital where for the first time he was given adequate food, clean sheets, and most importantly, books. The books were the greatest luxury for young Frank. He found the words a beautiful escape and got to read Shakespeare for the first time.
And it's like having jewels in my mouth when I say the words.
If I had a whole book of Shakespeare, they could keep me in the hospital for a year.
When you have nothing, little things become very precious, like books. There was an occasional book came into our house, and we just devoured it.
When Frank was 11 years old, World War II was in full swing. His father left for London, where labor was needed, as the men of England were off fighting. As Dad disappeared over the horizon, so did the promises of money sent home and a better future. The elder McCourt never returned. Angela and the children were left to attempt survival in absolute squalor. And the church was no help. At 13, Frank was rejected from the Christian Brothers School, and being the oldest, was forced to work in order to help the family. He got a job as a delivery boy and helped out a local debt collector who heard his talent for words. She had him write collection letters that were a success, and for the first time, Frank was validated for his mental acuity. Having always felt the outsider, that recognition fueled his desire for a better life, which for Frank meant a return to America. He saved whatever he didn't give to Angela, and by the age of 19, finally had enough for a ticket on a cheap freighter back to New York. On the voyage back, Frank met a priest who got him a room and a job at the Biltmore Hotel. McCourt sent half his pay home and eked out a meager existence in New York City. Just as his youthful pilgrimage back to Ireland for better circumstances backfired, Frank's return to New York did little to improve his situation.
I was liberated by the Chinese who attacked Korea, and America drafted me, sent me to Germany for 2 years. So I don't know what I would have done if the Chinese hadn't attacked Korea. I'm a victim of history in Ireland, and I'm a beneficiary of history in America.
Back in New York after the war, though armed with the GI Bill, he lacked the one remaining thing needed to go to college, a high school diploma. After a slow day packing meat on the docks, he found himself at the White Horse Tavern. The White Horse was a gathering place for literary types, and where writer Dylan Thomas famously took his last fateful drink. Over sausage and a beer, Frank was jealous of the other customers and had a heavy head about his place in the world.
I shouldn't be in this bar with poets and artists all sitting there with their serious, whispered conversations. I walk out the door across Hudson Street, along Bleecker Street, not knowing where I'm going, but knowing I have to keep walking till I know where I'm going. And here I am in Washington Square, and there's New York University. And I know that's where I have to go with my GI Bill, high school or no high school.
He found the admissions office and filled out the application. When asked why the section for high school was empty, he was honest, but also dazzled the dean with his knowledge of Melville, Dostoevsky, Joyce, and of course, Shakespeare. The dean agreed to allow him admission with the condition that he maintain a B average. McCourt did not disappoint, and in fact, excelled. After graduating with a degree in English, the man who never went to high school began teaching high school in the city's vocational system. McCourt's hunger for education continued, and after several years, earned a master's degree from CUNY's Brooklyn College. The irony of earning an advanced degree in the borough where he was born into absolute poverty was not lost on McCourt. Armed with an advanced degree, he moved on to teach English at the prestigious Stuyvesant High School for the remainder of his career as an educator.
I still was never one of the boys. I was never one of the boys in Ireland. I was never one of the boys in the army, and I was always on the periphery. The only place that I felt completely comfortable was in the classroom.
Years earlier, Frank's younger brother, Malachi Jr., had followed Frank to New York. The more gregarious sibling ended up as an actor and radio host, and consistently encouraged his literary older brother to write the story of their childhood. But Frank never got around to it. It took many years, and a career spent in education, when Frank finally decided to heed his little brother's demands.
You have to get the rhythms, and you have to, above all, find the voice. And it took me all those years, not till I retired. But I had the material. That's the main thing. The material was circling around my head and lying there in my notebooks, waiting to be tapped.
Frank's memoir, Angela's Ashes, went on to become an international success, staying on the New York Times bestseller list for 115 weeks. It won Frank the Pulitzer Prize for Biography in 1997 and was made into a feature film. 2 more books followed, picking up where Angela's Ashes left off. Tis, about his return to America, and Teacher Man, chronicling his years as an educator. This unlikely child of poverty turned soldier, student, teacher, and now world-renowned author was finally able to write the book, because through it all, though humble and more than a little unsure, Frank had never closed the door on what was possible.
This is their last high school class and mine. The bell rings and they sprinkle me with confetti. I'm told to have a good life. I wish them the same. I walk color-speckled along the hallway. Someone calls, "Hey, Mr. McCourt, you should write a book." I'll try.